Central Region Aging Network webinar. And today's seminar is titled Ambiguous Loss Moving Forward. We're delighted to have with us Dr. Michelle Crable, a professor and youth development specialist at University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension 4-H Youth Development. In addition to her expertise in positive youth development environments in out-of-school and informal education settings, Dr. Crable is also a member of the UNL Rural Wellness Team, where she delivers QPR training and ambiguous loss counseling to Nebraskans. Her graduate degrees are in Family Studies and Human Services from Kansas State University. During this webinar, Dr. Crable will share her knowledge and insights on ambiguous loss, helping us to better recognize and cope with this complex and difficult issue. We hope that by the end of the session, you will have a better understanding of ambiguous loss and the tools and resources available to help you and your loved ones move forward. Please join me welcoming Dr. Michelle Crable to the webinar. Michelle, you're welcome to share your screen and start your presentation. Thank you for being here with us.
Thanks so much for that kind introduction. We'll get started here. One thing that was asked, is some of you heard parts of this conversation, some of you didn't. But I will say this, that if you are have any questions at any time about any of the content, please feel free to pipe in with a question, type it in the chat box. I will also admit that this old dog has a little bit of a hard time learning new tricks. So sometimes it's hard for me to work on the presentation and check the chat box, but Lacey and Marisa are going to be doing that as well. So feel free to ask any questions at any time. This topic is one that I have been interested in since Dr. Pauline Boss came out with her book, Ambiguous Loss. And I have just been fascinated by it. And recently I've had an opportunity to work on this because of some of the farm crisis issues. And so it's really an exciting topic for me, even though I know it's something we all deal with. I shouldn't say it's exciting. I enjoy the topic. I'm very interested in the topic, and it's something that I think impacts all families. I also think this topic is really incredibly relevant for the aging population. For those of you who work in the aging area, this topic is extremely important, just simply because of dementia and just in some ways aging in general. So with that, I'm kind of curious. I'm going to do this before I go to my slide deck. Where are you from? And I know that you're from the North Central region, but where are you from and what are your positions? Are you county faculty? Are you state faculty? Are you aging specialists? I'm just curious to know a little bit who's on the call today or who's on the webinar today. So if you could type that in the chat box, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, so this is great. We have a really diverse group of people here. So I'm excited to see everywhere from administration to specialists to FNEP personnel. So this is great. I really do appreciate you being on the call and taking some time to learn about this. My guess is that you will relate to this conversation and dialogue that we have today on a personal and a professional level. And so you will probably think about grandparents, maybe even your own parents, when we're going through this topic. So again, feel free to ask any questions or to pop up with an example or whatever, because this is just a conversation rich for discussion. So like I said, the title of today is Ambiguous Loss Moving Forward. And I'm Michelle Crable. I've been at the University of Nebraska for 14 years. And like I said, graduate degrees are in Family Studies and Human Services at Kansas State University. We're going to move on. Oops. So what I want to, I've kind of done this already, but I want to acknowledge that this work is based on a changing way of life of ambiguous loss and farming created by the University of Minnesota Extension. And then certainly Dr. Pauline Boss from the University of Minnesota is the founder of this work. She has done some amazing work in this area, and I want to give all credit. The information I'm sharing with you today is based on her work. I also want to say that some of this work has been funded by the North Central Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Center. We had some funding through them to do some of this work as well. So I'm just curious, we have talked about this term ambiguous loss. We're in the process of doing some web design and some work with this, and we've been working with communications people, and they're like, what is this term? What do you mean by ambiguous loss? And so I'm just curious. I have 3 questions here on the screen. If you want to speak up, unmute yourself, or if you want to type in the chat box, address any of these questions. What are your thoughts when you hear this term? Maybe what are some feelings come to mind? And then what questions do you have? Loss that may not be easy to see, good. Loss that is not socially recognized or validated. The word lonely is good. Validated is also key. Thank you. Uncertain outcomes. Excellent. Dementia. I will definitely use a lot of dementia examples today. Hard to find support. Thanks, Ashton. Well, I'm going to encourage you to kind of keep thinking about this change in relationships. That's excellent. So here talking about a temporary loss or an ambiguous loss seems to be a great definition for grief that cannot be attributed to a specific event, but a series of events or state of emotional life. We'll talk about all of these things. The hard part about defining ambiguous loss is it's a little ambiguous. And so that's what makes it a little challenging, but we'll talk about some characteristics and some types. And again, all based on Pauline Boss's work. So thank you for contributing to the conversation. So the way Boss describes it in her 1999 book is it is a loss that is confusing, uncertain, unverified, and goes on and on. So when you talk about this, it is a loss that may be hard to define. Somebody talked about it being unvalidated. That can be part of this. In her initial work, she looked at persons, she interviewed families where they were experiencing somebody missing in action from the Vietnam War. And that, if you want to think about a loss that's confusing, we think he's alive, we're not for sure, we don't have a body, the military hasn't told us, there's a lot of uncertainty, it's not verified that this person has died, they're just missing in action, we don't know what's going on. And that goes on and on and on and on. Is there an end date to that? At some point, maybe there will be, but it can go on and on. Someone described this in another webinar I did. Someone described it as loss that there's not a Hallmark card for, which I thought was another interesting way to talk about it. It is so not defined. It's hard to articulate. So the responses that you had in the chat box are spot on. And the loss is something that can be a physical loss, an item, a person, or money, or a psychological loss, which is a relationship, meaning, or identity. And there's a variety of ways these losses might take place or might happen. I think about natural disasters are times of physical loss, psychological losses, such a loss of an identity, maybe because of an illness. I'm no longer able to be a farmer because I lost my mobility due to Parkinson's. So there's a variety of things that can happen and why losses take place. Ambiguous loss, kind of what is it, is simply it's complicated. Some of these losses that people might face are simply, it's hard to put into words. It's hard to describe. So some examples that I can use would be about a loved one maybe issuing or thinking about, not issuing, but having the onsets of dementia. We don't know what's happening to grandma, but something is happening to grandma. Something's not right about her. So it's hard to name, it's complicated. It is a loss that's generally unresolved. It may be the mourning of the loss of, like I said, an identity. It may be the loss of a relationship, but there is usually some type of piece that is not resolved. It often remains unclear and without closure, which all of these three, you see how they can tie together. And typically there's no official validation or ritual that any loss occurred. So in the case of death, which is the one that we have the most in our US culture, the loss that we have the most ritual around, we have a funeral or a memorial service or a celebration of life. We get together publicly, we mourn that. In some of our communities, especially in the Midwest, we bring over dishes, we help nurture the family that way, we send cards, we send flowers, we rally as a community behind this. And so the loss of a death is, we do have some ritual around that. Ambiguous loss doesn't have those rituals. And that's what makes it hard, because then that support can be harder to obtain. So how does it feel and how do you cope? There are no rituals of support. So families are left to cope on their own. Going back to the example of the families who may have someone in the military who's missing in action, how do you mourn that? Or how do you cope with, we don't know what happened to John. We don't know what happened to Harold. There's no one here to support us, and we don't know what to do with this. The challenge in that is that ambiguity freezes the process of grief and prevents some cognition or acknowledgement. This is what's going on. And it often blocks the process of coping and decision making. So that's where ambiguous loss gets really tricky. You have maybe this ambiguous event or situation that's happening, but the real challenge is how it freezes and can make families feel hopeless or helpless. And that's where the struggle really is. So I want to focus today on some tips to help families as you work with families and counties, or as you work with some county faculty that are working directly with families. There's some pieces in here that I hope are helpful that you can use with them. Because that, to me, the kind of the second point in here is one of the most challenging parts about dealing with ambiguous loss, is this what we'll talk about is frozen grief. And then not having definite information, people become immobilized, and then they have these feelings of hopelessness, and confusion. And so if you think about that, if you don't know if your child who has been sent over for military duty is alive or dead, do you grieve? Do you keep hope alive that they're going to come back? What do you do with their physical bedroom? And maybe that's a moment stuck in time in the family home. So there's a lot of things that we can talk about. Again, if you put this through the lens of Alzheimer's or dementia, or even just simply the aging process, you can see where feelings of helplessness or hopelessness and confusion may arise. I definitely think about families and dealing with a couple of grandparents who've had dementia, dealing with that. What are we going to do with mom? What are we going to do with grandma? And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the family situations and family coping with that. What I want to simply say is that ambiguous loss is really a very common part of life. For some people, it may be one thing, it may be a chronic illness that they're dealing with. For some, it may be an issue of a disappearance, addiction, divorce. All of these things can be a part of ambiguous loss, and they're very common parts of our life. I don't think anybody goes through life and doesn't experience some kind of ambiguous loss. So it is a very common part of family life. There are two types of ambiguous loss, and the one I think that will be more particularly of interest is the second of the two for this group. But the first one is that I've also been referring to throughout the webinar so far, is where you're physically absent but kept psychologically present. Simply, there is no proof of death. So I've been using the missing in action example, disappearances, military deployments can be that. We know this person is alive, but they are not physically here with us during a deployment. In her book, she also talked about adoption. Children who are adopted may have questions around not knowing who their parents are. And so that ambiguous loss can be really challenging and difficult for them. Divorce can be that. We know mom's out there, but we don't see her very often. We don't know when we're going to see her again. So, but we know she's there, but we don't physically see her. Desertion. And one of the other things that Boss really spent a lot of time researching was the idea of immigration from another country to the US. And that one to me is fascinating. When I think about my own family, there were certainly a lot of stories in our family that were shared at Thanksgiving and Christmas and holidays around the old homeland. And maybe at those times you have foods that remind you of the homeland. And this longing, I'll never forget my great uncle talking about, I wonder what happened to all our relatives that stayed behind. And so this idea of longing for that homeland, missing foods, missing tradition, missing family members. So in places where if you have a lot of migration or immigration, that can be something that families might be experiencing. The next one, which I think is the one that's really important for this conversation, for this group, is psychologically absent but physically present. So you think about someone who's experiencing Alzheimer's or is experiencing some kind of dementia. They are here, but it's no longer mom. Mom wouldn't do that. Mom wouldn't say these things. Mom used to be this way, but now she's this way. Dad was this way, but now he's this way. So dementia is the first example here. Brain injury, serious chronic mental illness can be a part of that, and addictions can be a part of that as well. So people, well, he wasn't like that before he started using heroin. This is not the son I raised. This is not the son I know. This is the addicted son. The son I remember was full of life and was a good athlete. But I don't understand this person now that steals or is violent. And so those things might be happening with addiction. So I'm just going to check in. Are there any questions so far about what we've covered, or anything that you're feeling rings a bell? Or I asked the question before I got the slide. Any reactions to what's been discussed so far?
I'm just going to speak up because this is easier. I really like the example of the immigration that you give, being someone that, is away from family for the most part of the year. And I've never looked at it from that perspective. And that really opened my eyes. Thank you.
You're welcome. Other thoughts or reactions? One of the things that you will hear, and I've been doing this been working with farm families and farm women actually on this topic, and you hear this, I didn't know there was a name for this. And it's almost like a permission to be able to maybe grieve or think about things differently. I didn't know there was a name for this. I totally get it. I get the concept. I have these feelings, but I didn't know there was a name for this. So any other thoughts or comments?
I'm just saying wow to the loss without a homework card. That's yeah, that's what really stuck with me.
Thank you. Appreciate the comments.
We have a few comments in the chat as well. Kristen says she realized that everyone goes through some type of ambiguous loss in their lifetime, and it should be talked about more. And Julie says it strikes her how ambiguous loss is such a part of everyone's experience. And yeah, we don't talk about it and research it enough.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated by the topic is this is something we all experience. And I'm not for sure why we don't talk about it. I don't know if we don't have the tools to talk about it or if it's a cultural thing or what, but it does strike me. And I'm so excited that I was asked to be a part of this webinar series because I hope you find it helpful today, again, in your own personal and professional lives. So thank you for the reactions and the comments. So we've talked about the characteristics of ambiguous loss, and now I want to talk a little bit about some of the grief that is surrounded with ambiguous loss. So there's an anticipatory grief, and I think about this in the case of aging and dementia, it's realizing a loss is imminent before the loss has occurred. So it's that piece around, we know something's wrong with grandpa, and we know he's aging, and eventually we know he's going to die, and there's grief with that. And so I think that is a really, with the aging process, this is one that we would see would be fairly common. I think about a friend of mine, actually a friend mentor of mine, whose husband had Alzheimer's, and she said, I lose a little piece of him every day. And that really struck me as kind of like, this is not the man I married, not the man I fell in love with, but I lose a little bit of him every day, knowing that the end result was going to ultimately be his death. Disenfranchised grief is a grief that is not understood or taken seriously. I think about miscarriage is a beautiful example of this. If you know someone who's experienced a miscarriage, oh, get over it. You can have another baby. All of those things that kind of go, it was only 2 months old. It was no big deal. They should get over that. Often that's the kind of things that happen. I think about farm-related injuries as the example I've been using in some of the work I've been doing with farm women and farm families. I think that is a grief that, oh, they hurt their back, they'll get over it. But those can be very significant losses and grief. And then frozen grief is a little bit harder here. It's the result of an ambiguity of not knowing whether any effort will be successful. And so it may be, we're going to try something with Parkinson's, but we don't know. You're trying to salvage something. And so the example I give in the farm workshops are around, we may sell off this so we can save this part of the farming operation. We may sell the cow-calf operation so we can save the crops piece. And this is where identity, I think, can come into play here too. You may really identify as a rancher, but the ranching part of it is not profitable, so you have to become a crops person. And that shift in identity may be really hard, and it may be really, really hard to get over that. And I'll give you one example. It's not an example of frozen, well, maybe it is an example of frozen grief. My grandfather was a farmer in South Central Kansas. The state of Kansas came in and kind of forced him off the farm, so to speak, to put in Cheney Reservoir. He always felt like he never got a good price for the family farm. And he went to his grave kind of stuck in that grief, that the home place that they had him and grandma had worked so hard to establish was kind of taken from them. I mean, those were the words he would use. He never got over that. And I would put that in the frozen grief category. So that is, and we'll talk a little bit more about frozen grief later on, but you can see these various types of grief. Yeah, so another example is there is somebody who's infertility, right? Could very much be a frozen grief or a disenfranchised grief as well. Certainly a type of ambiguous loss. So what we want to do, and I think that the question is, what can we do in extension? What's our role in extension? And I've always been taught, and I've been working in extension for quite a few years, is that really we're in the prevention field. So what I think kind of the goal moving forward as we talk for the next 25 minutes or so, 20 minutes or so, is really about building resilience. And so Boss talks about, we want to build resilience to lower stress and anxiety caused by ongoing ambiguity. And we know right now that depression and anxiety are a problem in the US, not only for just teenagers, but for the general population as well. And so how can we build resilience is one of our questions that we need to ask ourselves. And I think this is a perfect place for extension to function, is building resilience. The other piece that she says is that we really need to help people develop a tolerance for living with unanswered questions. And I think given today's cultural values in the US, that is really challenging. How do we live with unanswered questions? We like certainty, we like structure, we like a variety of things that don't deal well with ambiguity. There are two main options for dealing with ambiguous loss: is holding out for the truth or developing a new narrative one can live with. And the second option is really the best option. What is that new narrative? And we're going to talk in the next few slides about how you can build that new narrative. So this to me is all a part about resiliency. So naming what you're going through is one of the most important things. So in the case, I'm going to take this in case of infertility, is simply naming that. I'm having a hard time getting pregnant. And those feelings around that may be things like jealousy. I watch all of my friends get pregnant and I can't. It may be infertility is a very expensive, often not covered by insurance. So it may be financial concerns. It may be feeling alone. Nobody else has experienced this. Feelings of confusion are often uncommon with that. Why can't I get pregnant? The other piece that I haven't talked about that I do want to mention here is that often ambiguous loss challenges a person's perceptions and thoughts about what is fair and right in the world. Ambiguous loss often doesn't feel fair. It's not fair I can't get pregnant. It's not fair Dad got Parkinson's. It's not fair that our family farm got taken out by a tornado. And so the sense of fairness also comes into play here. One of the most important things kind of moving forward is, how do you make new meaning of the loss? And this can be often really hard. And there is no magic bullet here on this one. This is time and a combination. I like to say that often resiliency and mental health, I will also say obesity prevention is all this way too. There is a recipe. We're not going to get ourselves out of a situation by one answer. It's often we need a combination of X with a combination of Y with a combination of Z, and we mix that together, and then hopefully we have some positive outcomes. I just don't think there's just one simple answer for a lot of the complex issues we're facing in the US today. So how do we make new meaning of the loss? That can be around reevaluating or reconstructing identity. And so it may be that shift, as I gave around the cow-calf kind of operator. I'm no longer a rancher, I'm a crops person. It may be in a volunteer role. I'm now a grandpa. And so I can let go of kind of the work identity, but I'll focus in on this family identity. So there's a variety of ways that can happen. One thing we haven't talked about here is retirement. And I neglected to mention that retirement can very much be an ambiguous loss because of the loss of identity. I am an extension worker. And what happens when I'm no longer that extension worker? It would be very easy for there to be a grief about that. So then reshifting that identity to playing volunteer, to playing community member, to just having validation for being a person. When I was preparing for this talk this morning, I was reading through Boss's book again. And one of the things that she gave an example of was a woman whose husband who had dementia. She was his caregiver. She ended up, I think, putting him in a nursing home kind of a thing to get additional care. And she talked about how the woman in her caregiving was really struggling, and what she did to kind of reframe the situation. And one of the things that she did was she thought of herself, she shifted her identity to say, I'm no longer a spouse, I am a caregiver. And I thought that's really interesting. And then what happened is when he died, she said, I am now a widower, which I thought was interesting, that there was this various types of shift of identity throughout her husband's journey with dementia. The other part would be normalizing the ambivalence. And so just saying, this is common. As we've talked about in the chat box already today, these are common things we all deal with. For some reason, we don't talk about it. And to just name that, I've experienced this too. One of the things, again, I was reading more of Boss's work this morning. She talked about seeking information. So if you, I keep giving examples kind of again from the aging population, but I'll play on Parkinson's. If you have a spouse or a parent or a sibling who gets diagnosed with Parkinson's, finding out information about Parkinson's can help build resilience and help you move forward. That may even help in your identity formation that looks a little differently about, I can be an advocate now, and you may see yourself as an advocate. So seeking out information helps with that. Discovering hope, I can't emphasize enough as an importance for this. It is also in suicide prevention research, we know hope is extremely important. So I can't emphasize how important hope is here. Keeping a sense of humor is also important. Sometimes when dealing with Alzheimer's and dementia, you just have to laugh at some of the funny and silly things a family member might say. Even though it may seem a little wrong or a little bit off color to laugh at that, you have to. If you don't keep a sense of humor, then it can be pretty dark. And so that Pauline Boss really encourages people to develop a sense of humor. The next thing that I think is the next 2 points that I think are really important. And again, these are areas that we as Extension, all of these areas are about resilience, are areas that we as Extension can help build and think creatively about how we might put some of these things in place for our community. How do we build community? And one of the quotes that I read this morning from Boss was, "Coping doesn't happen in a vacuum." And I thought that was really profound. The reality is we need each other. And if it is simply just, I'm going to pick on Ashton because Ashton's a former student of mine. Actually, she's not on now, but Ashton's a former student of mine, and we need each other. I need her checking in on me. She needs me checking in on her. And it's as simple as, how are you doing? How's the new job? How's life? And so those kind of building community where you have someone that you're engaged with, that you're checking in on, extremely important. I haven't had the chance yet, and I would encourage all of you to look at the Surgeon General's bulletin on loneliness and isolation. I'm dying to get my hands on that. I just didn't have any chance yesterday to read that. We need each other, and we need community. The other thing that is really important, and we've talked a lot about this in the course of the pandemic, but I think it's a theme that we need to keep thinking about, engaging in self-care. So self-care looks different for different people, whether it's journaling, whether it's taking a walk, whether it's playing with the dog, whether it's playing with the grandkids, whatever the case may be. How do you engage in self-care? And this is a quote out of her book today that I just thought was beautiful, and I just took it verbatim out of her Ambiguous Loss book today. But respite is essential, and no one should feel guilty for taking it. And I thought about my aunt, who is caring for my uncle who has Parkinson's. And it is so easy to get absorbed in that caregiving role that you forget to take care for yourself. But we know it is absolutely essential for healthy balance and building resilience. The other thing that Boss talks about is what she called family meetings. I would talk about it as family communication. She is truly a therapist. I am not. I work in the prevention angle, but she talked about family meetings. And so this ambiguous loss doesn't happen in isolation. It happens with other family members as well. And especially in the case of Alzheimer's and dementia and Parkinson's and some of these diseases or health conditions that are associated with aging. So she talked about getting the family together as a place to state and acknowledge feelings and emotion and to communicate about the loss. Because sometimes that's one of the toughest things when you're facing challenges with caregiving is one sibling may have one perception, another sibling may have another perception, and that's where feelings of hurt and bitterness can happen. It's also where the families can kind of get gunked up and resentment and some of those things can take place. So just a chance for family members to acknowledge those feelings and emotions and to talk about their loss. It's also a place where you can get that person's feelings about their interpretation of their experience with that loss. I'll give you an example in the case of an aging parent or a grandparent. The loss may be as simple as mom's not doing Christmas meals anymore. She's not baking for the holidays. She's not able to host the family dinners. And that can be a real sense of loss. It's one of the many losses that may happen before death. So we've lost the tradition of going to grandma's, and grandma's great turkey gravy, or grandma's great German chocolate cake, whatever the case may be. And those traditions can be a very big part of ambiguous loss as well. Family meetings can give people an opportunity to restructure how the family functions. So maybe someone's heavily involved in caregiving and someone seems to be absent. Maybe those times in that communication, you can think about how that could restructure differently. And then the other thing that I think is important is I gave the example about Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas dinner or 4th of July holidays or Memorial Day holidays, whatever, is how do we think differently about family traditions? And so that can also be a real challenge, is maybe mom doesn't need to host the whole Christmas dinner, but maybe she could make a part of it. So she could make that famous chocolate cake in her own time versus having to clean house and worry about all the other components of hosting. So there's different ways to think about those different family traditions. Some of the tools that I think we need to talk about in building resiliency are around evaluating what are your own internal assets. I can't emphasize enough about the importance of friends and family and community. And with community, some of those circles of support may come from mental health professionals. If you are stuck in this grief and you can't get out, it may be time to talk to a mental health professional. Faith communities are really a first line of defense in getting support. They are the people that hopefully see you on a regular basis and ask, how are you doing? They may be the ones to bring you over a meal. They may be the ones who talk about life isn't fair in the context of a religion or a spiritual component. So faith communities are actually to me, very critical, and critical in the sense that they are found in most every corner of the US. And so whether it's small town South Dakota, or whether it's rural Kansas, whether it's rural Nebraska, faith communities are usually there and a very important part of community life. And then lastly, our support groups. So in the case, again, of dementia, also the Alzheimer's group, cancers groups, those support groups, Alcoholics Anonymous, Alateen, Al-Anon, are examples of where people could get some kind of support around maybe a specific type of illness, disease, addiction. All right, move on slide. Want to end here a little bit. The getting help is simply ask for help. If you are finding yourself in this situation, you can ask for it informally professional. Call up that girlfriend, call up that friend that you've had, and just say, we need to do coffee. We need to take a walk. I need to let some steam out of the pressure cooker is kind of one of my lines. Using one's circles of support. If you feel that things are hopeless enough where you are thinking about suicide or harming yourself, please reach out to the text the 988 number in regards to getting some crisis help. I also listed the rural response hotline, and again, that's been some of my farm work, but that is another piece that can be done. Helping others. This is where I think our role in extension is really important. We know if you've ever worked in a county, you know you have the person who always comes in every Tuesday because they had coffee with so-and-so, so they've just got to stop into their local extension office, right? And so listening is a really important, asking open-ended questions with people that you know who are maybe experiencing loss that is challenging. Tell me more. How are you doing? Being available for conversation. I always say, put the phone down. And sometimes I just ask my friends if I really need them. Are you available right now? I've also cleared my schedule. I've skipped meetings. if I'm engaged in a good conversation that I feel like is more important than the next meeting I have to go to. Picking appropriate time and place for those to happen. Sometimes that happens naturally, sometimes it doesn't. But that's an important piece as well. So it's an appropriate time and place so people can feel listened. They feel like they have the space to say things that might be confidential. Offering hope and support, we talked about that before. I am QPR trained, so it's a suicide prevention tool, and we talk a lot about offering hope and support. We need you is one statement we talk about in QPR. You are important to us. You are important to this family. So offering hope and support, I think, are absolutely critical. Making referrals if you need to. If you are talking with someone and you think that they're possible to harm themselves, make that referral to either the local emergency room, to your mental health facilities. It depends on what resources you have available. Certainly the 988 number works as well. Make those referrals. And then use community resources. I can't emphasize that enough. If you may be the person that facilitates them getting help, but use those professionals in those areas. We have about 10 minutes or so left. I will entertain any questions. If anyone has any questions or any discussion around, I threw a lot of information at you. I'm also kind of curious to know a little bit how you might use this work or use this information in your work in extension. Thank you, Marissa. You're very kind. Thoughts, questions, ideas?
Overall, I thought this content was valuable. I think sometimes we forget about disease processes and how those create feelings of loss, aging, dealing with some of the decline that happens as we get older. I think that's a good reminder. So I thank you. It was really good information.
You're welcome. Other thoughts or comments, questions? My contact information, if you have questions about the work that we're doing in Nebraska about this. One of the things that we hope to do or in the process of doing, we're already got some of the work done. We are going to be adding to our rural wellness website a kind of web page or web pages, I should say, on ambiguous loss as it relates to agriculture, but you can kind of take the agriculture out of there, and we'll use some other examples. Aging is certainly one that we will probably be doing some examples with as well. So kind of stay tuned. That's one of my big projects for this summer is to get our ambiguous loss web pages up so people can share that. We're creating a series of videos. We're working on some handouts and some of those kind of things to go along with that. So kind of stay tuned for some pieces from the University of Nebraska about that. One question that didn't get asked of me, which usually does, is am I willing to share my slides? And would you find the slides helpful, or any pieces around sharing the slide information? Okay. Well, I'll work with Lacey on that.
So the only challenge is we don't have email addresses. So if anybody wants email addresses, you're going to have to collect them, or you're going to maybe drop your email in and have them reach out to you directly, because people don't pre-register for these webinars. So we don't have a way to contact them.
Okay. I'll just put my email. If you are interested and want the slides, just email me and I'll send them to you.
And then hang on. So There will be a recording of the webinar. Thank you, Chelsea, for getting the information about how to get signed up for future presentations, though that's a really strange looking URL you put in there. But we have a survey. It's on the screen, but I dropped the link in chat if you could give us feedback. Again, if you would like to be notified about upcoming webinars from the North Central Region Aging Network, we just ask that you sign up for our listserv. And that will get you added. Chelsea, is that the right link?
Yeah, it's the right link.
Okay, it just looks strange. So that
I
link that
know, it's
Chelsea,
the one off of our website though.
but the link that Chelsea put in can get you signed up for our newsletter, so you get notified when we have upcoming webinars. The link I put in is feedback for our webinar. And our next webinar will be Loss, Grief, and Mourning. It is scheduled for June 2nd at 10 a.m. Central. Is there anything else you want to say, Michelle?
I don't. I just appreciate everyone being on the webinar today. Hopefully this was helpful information, again, for you personally and professionally. And thank you for contributing. So I thank you for your time on a Friday morning. And thanks for the kind words as well. I appreciate that.
Very good. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Michelle, thank you so much on behalf of all of us. It was really a wonderful presentation.
You're welcome. I'm going to stop the recording.